Okay, well, as Sam said, my name is Chris Passero. I'm from the Army Corps of Engineers Omaha District, and I'm the project manager for this study. And this is of course, the Section 205 flood risk management study for Miles City. And so, like Sam mentioned, we want to have the Corps of Engineers team introduce themselves. They're all sitting behind you. So I'll ask each of them maybe just to stand up and introduce yourself and say what your role is on the study team.
My name is Greg Johnson. I'm a hydraulic engineer by training, but I'm actually the chief of the plan formulation and project management section. So Chris works as one of the project managers in my office.
I'm Curtis Miller. I'm a hydraulic engineer, so I've worked on some of the hydraulic modeling and some of the design of the levee features that we'll talk about today.
I'm an economist.
Tyler Kelly, also an economist.
Nolan Chiquette, I'm a floodplain engineer.
John Schoen, biologist, so they're looking at the environmental resources that may be affected.
Joshua Porter, I'm a soils and levee engineer, so I do most of the design work on the levee and flood protective features themselves.
I am Patrick Nowak, and I'm an economist with the Corps of Engineers.
Thanks, everyone. As Sam said, this is the team that's been working on the study and doing all the analysis that's gone into what we're going to present today. And so I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. It's been a couple of years since I've been up here in Miles City. I've done flood awareness days online a time or two, I think. But even though a lot of you have been following this project, I'm still going to go over some background because like Sam said, she's recording it. And if anyone who's maybe new to the project wants to check it out, we want them to have just a little bit of background. So I'll go over some background and then update where we are with the study now and the results that we've gotten to date. So just as an overview, Miles City requested this study from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and it's under the Section 205 program to address flood risk. So the Section 205 program is an authorization that we have to study flood risk management projects that are generally smaller in size and they can be implemented without specific congressional authorization. Under the study, the design and construction costs are shared between the Corps and the non-federal sponsor. So Miles City, of course, is a non-federal sponsor for this study. And for the feasibility study, which is the phase we're in now, costs are shared 50-50. And for design and construction, costs are shared 65 federal, 35 non-federal. And then for operations and maintenance, the costs are 100% non-federal. And under Section 205, the maximum total federal share that can be invested in the project is $10 million. So this is the study area again. So it's Miles City, so the Tongue River, both banks, and it goes from upstream of Interstate 94 all the way down to the confluence. So right along both banks of the Tongue River, and then the Yellowstone River right bank from upstream of the water plant to downstream of the wastewater treatment plant. So when we talked at past meetings about this study, we said that the study area could be expanded if there were additional interests or issues raised. It could still be expanded if there were something that was raised that should be considered under the study, but to date, we haven't expanded the study area from where we started initially. And just real quickly, the overall process for a feasibility study for a flood risk management project is identifying the flood problem, which of course we've done in Miles City, and then identify and evaluate flood risk management alternatives. And we look at structural alternatives like dams and levees, and then non-structural alternatives like flood proofing or relocation. And kind of the major way to think about those things are the structural alternatives are the things intended to keep water away from people and property, like a levee that keeps water in the river instead of overbank. And then non-structural are alternatives that could keep people and property away from floodwater, like elevating homes or having robust emergency action plans to evacuate people from a flood area in the event of a flood. And the Corps is charged with determining what's called the National Economic Development Plan. And so that's the plan that has the greatest net economic benefits to the nation. There are other things that we consider like regional economic development benefits and other social effects of a plan. But really the major thing that we need to look at in identifying a plan is net economic development benefits to the nation. And then we can look at other plans like a locally preferred plan. And that would be if we've identified what we call the NED plan or the National Economic Development Plan, but the sponsor would like to do something a little different. We can identify that plan as a locally preferred plan. And then ultimately we complete the feasibility report and make a recommendation on a plan we would want to implement. And we also always have the alternative of recommending no action. We can do a study and recommend that we take no action. So just the study schedule and the current status. The study started in 2017 and it's expected to last roughly through 2022. So it was suspended from 1st of July 2019 to the 30th of July 2020. So that's basically the fiscal year 2019-2020 for the city of Miles City due to the city's fire station replacement project. And so prior to that time, we had estimated the existing and future without project conditions, which is looking at what the existing conditions are in the study area and looking at what we think the future conditions will be if we don't implement any sort of project. And we had started formulating alternative plans. And then we picked it up again in about July of 2020. And we've developed those plans further, and we've done some preliminary analysis of those. And over the course of about the next year, our aim would be to develop one or a couple of those plans further and select a plan that we think we can recommend. And then we would develop a draft report, go through a public involvement process, and after that, develop a final report that we would submit for review and approval. And the ultimate goal, of course, is to get a plan approved that could be implemented to provide the flood risk management benefit to the city. So I already talked about this just a little bit, that we evaluate existing conditions in the future without project conditions, and we formulate and evaluate alternative plans and the no action plan on the basis of net economic benefits and environmental impacts. We also consider, like I said, cultural resources impacts and other social effects, but these are two of the biggest things that we'd be considering for Miles City. And as far as what's been done so far, this is a kind of a recap of some of the things we talked about in the past. We did complete an evaluation of existing conditions, and we had identified a maximum affordable project range of $15.6 to $33.5 million. And some of you may recall that maximum affordable project is, we looked at what the damages are in the study area, and because a project has to have net economic benefits that are positive, we say that the maximum affordable project is about equal to the benefits that we calculated for the study area. So we calculated the damages or the benefits, because it would be damages avoided, as being 15.6 to 33.5 million. And so we would say the maximum affordable project is in that range. We developed an initial array of alternative plans, and we did that with a workshop here in Miles City in December of 2018. And then through some initial screening of alternatives, we reduced that to 12 levy alignments. And then we consider those further to try to develop different options for specific areas. And so those would be things like looking at a flood wall in an area where we're trying to avoid real estate impacts, or looking at using sheet pile to prevent water seeping under the levee in an area where we're trying to keep the levee footprint narrower. And then finally, we've done preliminary economic analysis of different levee alignments. So I'll just talk a little bit about the damage reaches and then stop for a minute to see if anyone has any questions about any of the background stuff before I start to talk about kind of where we are now. So the damage reaches in the study area that we'll talk about a little bit are reach 1, which runs from about, I-94 down to this this first railroad bridge. then reach 2 between the two railroad bridges, and then reach 3 along the Yellowstone, and then finally reach 4, which is on the left bank of the Tongue River. So before we talk more about these potential levee alignments, I just wanted to stop and see if anyone has any questions about that background. I tried to go over it kind of quickly because I know we've talked about it before, but if anyone has any questions or wants some clarification, I welcome those right now. I smile because I see one of my colleagues in the back row, but picking up a stumper for me, so.
What's he got?
I don't know, he's still working on it, I can tell. This is treacherous. Okay, so potential levee alignments. So you can see that we came up with potential levee alignments that by and large follow the existing levee alignment in Miles City. And there's good reasons for that. Number one, that's an established alignment, so the real estate impacts of using that same alignment are less. Now, we did look in each of these reaches. So again, we have reach 1, which is roughly from here to here. Reach 2 is roughly in here. And then reach, make sure I'm looking at this correctly. Okay, I'm sorry. Reach 1 is roughly from here to here. Reach 2 is roughly through here, and then reach 3 here. And you can see that each of those different colors represents a subsegment. So in those subsegments, that's where we looked at things that would distinguish between, say, a levee that was built with a wide cross section of what's called a seepage berm to prevent under seepage, versus maybe a levee that was built with a narrower cross section and sheet pile, which goes down below the center line of the levee to prevent that under seepage. So those are two different options that would help prevent real estate impacts. And in some areas, we even looked at a flood wall where you'd have a vertical concrete wall instead of a levee. And underneath that, you would have sheet piles. So that gives an even narrower footprint. So that doesn't really show up in this graphic, but as we looked at each of those subsegments, we considered different alternatives that would help meet specific goals like avoiding real estate impacts or reducing operation and maintenance costs and so forth. And we analyzed each of those by looking at the cost of each of those segments, and the cost was based on an initial estimate of the cost of building the levee, as well as initial estimate of operating and maintaining the levee in the long term. And then we looked at the benefits of that over a 50-year period. And then we compared the present value of the cost with the present value of the benefits to determine in each subsegment which alternative was economically the most feasible, meaning had the greatest net economic benefits. And so the preliminary results that we have are shown in this table. And I wanted to talk for just a minute about what we mean by low riprap and high riprap. So as we've developed the different levee alignments, one of the things we've identified as a really primary cost driver of the cost of the levee is protecting it from erosion. So as all of you probably know, the Tongue River and the Yellowstone can have a pretty high erosion potential, especially like when it's ice out in the springtime and there's ice coming down. And especially in areas like there are in Miles City, there's some areas where because of bends in the Tongue River, it'll be coming straight at the levee at some point, and then it'll turn as it meets the levee. So those are particular areas where we wanted to take a hard look at what kind of erosion protection would be required. And we developed what we called a low riprap estimate, which is what we think is a low end estimate of how much protection is required for the levee, and a high end estimate, which is what we think is a reasonable high end estimate of what will be required. And in reality, probably if we were designing the levee completely, we would come somewhere in between those two. But that's why this is called low riprap and high riprap, because those two are kind of bracketing what we think is the likely cost for that levee alignment. that is shown in this slide. And so you can see that for these, we show the total annual benefits of each, and those are the same because we're talking about the same levy alignment for each one. The total cost of the levy, which ranged from about 36.5 million for the low riprap estimate up to about 64 million for the high riprap estimate. And then those total annual costs, so those are the costs on an annual basis over a 50-year period. And then the net annual benefits, so those are the benefits minus the costs. And so you can see that for the low riprap, there's net annual benefits of about 700,000. And then for the high riprap, the net annual benefits are about negative 200,000. So if we were looking at just these two alternatives, we would say that the high riprap alternative is not economically feasible because the net benefits are negative. And if we were looking at the low riprap alternative, we'd say that one is potentially economically feasible because the net benefits are positive. And then that benefit cost ratio is just what it says it is. It's the total annual benefits over the total annual cost. So that gives an idea of basically how much return you get in benefits for each dollar of cost that goes into the project. So, like I said, the actual riprap requirement is probably somewhere in between that high and the low, and because that's one of the main drivers of the project cost. We think that there's probably an economically feasible levy project somewhere in that range, somewhere between that low estimate and high estimate. But like I mentioned earlier, for section 205, there's a maximum federal investment in the project of $10 million. And so as it's shown here, the maximum project cost for a section 205 project is approximately 15 million. The reason for that is that the federal share of 10 million goes partially toward the design of the project and the feasibility study for the project, which is we're doing the feasibility now, and we would do the design after that. And then beyond that, whatever is remaining of that federal share is shared 65% federal, 35% non-federal for the construction. And so when you take all those things into account, the cost of feasibility and design phases of the project, and then the cost share for implementation, we estimate that usually the maximum affordable project under section 205, or I should say the maximum allowable project under section 205 is about $15 million construction cost. So from what we've seen so far in our preliminary cost estimate, we probably won't have a project that's a full-length levy alignment for Miles City that would be implementable under section 205 because it would be greater than the section 205 project cost limit. And so we met earlier today with the city staff and kind of talked through this with them, and we've been brainstorming on what the best possible route forward for the project would be, and for moving the study forward to see if there's a project that we can implement. And there's a couple options that we've identified. The one is to continue under the section 205 program. And the way we could do this is if the pending federal infrastructure legislation would raise the or eliminate the section 205 project cost limit. So everyone's probably familiar with the fact that the Congress is looking at an infrastructure bill and what's called the Build Back Better plan. And so among the many provisions in those have been proposed provisions that would either raise or eliminate the cap on a section 205 project cost. So if that were to happen, there would be a possibility that we could continue studying this project under section 205 and then ultimately implement it under section 205. We won't know if that happens until it happens, but as time goes on, we'll have a better idea of whether that's likely to happen. The other option that we have is we could continue to study this under what's called our General Investigation Authority. So under that General Investigation Authority, there is no maximum project cost limit. However, projects, once they're ultimately approved and recommended for implementation, they have to be authorized by the Congress for construction. So the main difference is just at a high level between the section 205 program and the General Investigations program is that under section 205, there are fewer layers of approval required. So we at the Omaha district of the Army Corps of Engineers have to have a project approved by our division, which is called the Northwestern Division under section 205. If we were trying to implement a project under general investigations, it has to be approved by our headquarters in Washington, DC. So there's a difference in the level of approval required for the project. And then when it comes to implementation, under section 205, we don't need specific congressional authorization to implement a project. We just have to request funding, and pending availability of funding, we can move right into implementation. Whereas under the General Investigations Program, we have to seek congressional authorization, and it's authorized generally under the Water Resources Development Act, which happens. We just talked about this earlier today. It's been happening about every 2 years, and it's due to happen in 2022. So there are differences between those two programs in how, I'll say, how easy it is to get a project approved and to get it implemented. And we talked earlier with the city staff about kind of how we could best make a decision whether we would want to move to the General Investigations Program or try to stay in section 205 pending that cost limit being raised or eliminated. And so what we had decided to do is that to help aid the city with making that decision, and to aid the Corps as well with making that decision, that we should do some more work under the section 205 study to refine that riprap estimate. So it's really, we kind of know what our range of options is for the riprap. And what we at the Corps think we need to do is to consult with some of the experts within the Corps on design of levees for protection from ice impact and from erosion, and get their feedback on what level of riprap protection we could be using. And one of the reasons that we think that will help raise our confidence in the assumptions that we've made so far is that ultimately, if we're to design this project, it would be reviewed by different subject matter experts. And we would like to have some advanced review by experts in that particular area so that we identify now early in the study whether we've addressed that adequately versus learning that later in the study and having a surprise if we're told, well, no, you need to add more protection to the levee. So that's one thing that we could do. And then we could also, based on that, update our preliminary cost estimate and economic analysis. And what that would do is it would give us a better idea. Well, I'm going to back up just a little bit. It would give us a better idea of how accurate these estimates of net annual benefits and benefit cost ratio are. And it would allow us to have more confidence in that, because if we're considering going into a GI study, it would be helpful for both the Corps and the city to know, are we at a benefit cost ratio closer to 1.5, or are we at a benefit cost ratio closer to 1.2, say? Go ahead, sir.
What determines the total annual benefits?
So the total annual benefits are, and I'm going to ask one of our economists to elaborate on this just a little bit after I give a real general answer, but kind of the general answer is we look at the potential damages from a range of flood events within the study area. And we consider whether our project would prevent those damages. And so if our project can prevent damages, then those damages become benefits that would accrue to the project. And we look at those over a 50-year period of analysis, and then we take the present value of those. And so I'm going to ask Patrick Nowak, who's our lead economist, to, number one, Patrick, please correct me if I misstated anything, and then maybe just elaborate on that.
No, yeah, you're right, Chris. We look at, there's different, the main category benefit we look at is the inundation reduction benefits, the flooding that could happen if there was a flood event that inundated structures, residential and commercial structures. So that's the main benefit category. But then we also look at potential damages to like public utilities, streets and highways, and also like emergency cost savings that might be prevented if our project prevented a flood from happening. So we look at those different benefit categories, And we look at over the range of possible flood events, like how much damage that would cost. And then we take that aggregate figure and we come up with an annualized figure. And we compare that annualized figure to the annualized cost benefits.
So money saved by the community for flood insurance yearly isn't added into that?
No, it's not.
Okay, just wondering if that was part of it or not. Thank you.
I think, and Patrick, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we can include benefits if there's savings to the city in administering a flood insurance program, we can include those, is that right?
That's right, but
Okay.
that's a pretty small,
Yeah.
that's a pretty small administrative cost savings. It's basically the cost of, you know, the paperwork or whatever it would cost to maintain the policy. So that's really pretty small.
So that's the only part related to flood insurance that we can include, but premium savings by residents, by property owners is something that we cannot include in that.
I was just wondering, because it seemed like a community benefit. So
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those benefits that I think it'd be nice if we could capture, but our policies don't allow us to do that. Because it is a tangible savings a lot of times to members of the community, of course. So back to those things that the Corps is going to do is, like I said, refine that our judgment on what riprap estimate we should be using, and then update our cost estimate and our preliminary economic analysis, and then perform a preliminary life safety analysis. So the reason for doing this is that in addition to the economic justification that we have to show for a project, we can use as an additional justification if the project has life safety benefits. So if we can show that building the project would reduce life safety risk for the community, we can use that to argue for implementing the project. And one area where this really comes in a lot of times is that when projects, especially if it's a GI project, it's competing against projects from all around the nation. And sometimes it's difficult for smaller communities to compete with larger communities, because if you have a big city that has really high population density and really high damages, they can show a higher net benefit for a similar project than a smaller city that maybe has less population density. And so one thing that can be used in either case, but is especially helpful for smaller communities, is if you can use other things like the ability to mitigate life safety risk to argue for implementing a project. And so we talked earlier, like I said, with the city about doing some of this additional analysis under the Section 205 study authority to help provide some additional information for making that decision. And so we talked roughly about a timeline that we would aim for. So the Corps would aim to complete this analysis and provide this additional information to the city by the beginning of January 2022. And in sort of our normal process for recommending projects for the General Investigations Program, that happens in about February. And so that would give the city as a study sponsor time to work with the Corps and decide if it makes sense to request to include this study under the General Investigations Program. And then possibly by that time, this is something that we really have no control over, but possibly by that time, we'll have a better idea of where the Congress is going with any infrastructure legislation and what the odds are of having a change to the project cost limit for Section 205. And then at that time, around February of 2022, we would aim to try to make a judgment of whether to stay in Section 205 under a program that has higher cost limits, or to move to GI under the normal general investigation process. And then I just want to mention, regardless of how we were to proceed with the study, the tasks that remain are, we'd want to refine the preliminary design we have. So right now we would say we have about a conceptual level of design, which is, if you think of design as ranging from 0% being you've done nothing up to 100% is complete, then we're maybe 10% design. And usually in a feasibility study, we try to get to about 30% level of design, because that helps us better understand what the costs and impacts of the project would be. So we would aim to advance that design to that 30% level, and that could include, in addition to additional design work, it could include more survey work if we need it. Sometimes it includes things like taking borings to determine what foundation conditions are, and determine in more detail what under seepage features we want to include in the levee design. So refining that project design, and then refining our cost estimate, and then refining our economic analysis. And then we would need to analyze environmental and cultural resource impacts. So to date, we haven't done a lot of work looking at environmental resource impacts. And the reason we haven't done that is that there were some alternatives we looked at in those subsegments that I talked about, where we would have done things like realign the river. And that would be basically dredging the far bank of the river so that we could move the river channel over, and that would give a greater setback distance for the levee. Now, those we ended up eliminating from consideration, because in addition to having a lot of environmental impacts that we would have to mitigate, they also would be very costly, and they would be kind of risky, because once you realign a river channel, oftentimes it would tend to want to move back to where it was over time. So we eliminated those, and then we determined that really from the ones that remained, the environmental impacts were pretty similar for all of them within a subsegment. So it didn't really matter too much whether we built a levee that had a broad cross section or whether we built a flood wall with a narrow cross section. The environmental impacts would have been similar. And so now that we've moved on to kind of limiting those alternatives that we consider, we would do more environmental impact assessment and look at mitigation. And one of the big things we've identified that would have to be mitigated in Miles City is there's a lot of trees on the existing levee, and the Corps does not allow vegetation on the levee other than grass cover to, for erosion preventions. So those trees would have to unfortunately be removed. And I know that's a great, resource for the city, but when those are removed, we would have to mitigate those somewhere else. So we would have to work with the city in determining where and how to mitigate the loss of those trees. And then any other environmental impacts there might be as well. And then cultural resource impacts, we haven't identified any specific cultural resources that would be impacted, but we would do some level of survey to identify if there are any, and if there are any that we need to mitigate. And then we would prepare a draft feasibility report, and NEPA, which is National Environmental Policy Act, that's the environmental documentation we have to do. We would prepare a NEPA document, and that's usually part of our draft feasibility report. And in that report and the NEPA document have to be reviewed, and that includes public review. And then finally, we prepare a final feasibility report, and we would submit that for review and approval. And we would follow those same general steps, whether it's a Section 205 study or a general investigation study. There's differences between the two, but the same general set of steps would apply. And then for public involvement, this meeting tonight is not one of our formal public involvement meetings like our initial scoping meeting that we have, or a public review meeting for a draft report, but anytime throughout the study, public involvement and public comment is welcome. So we include this slide in here that has a mailing address and an email address where you can provide public comments if you want to. So that's all I have in terms of presentation for tonight. I was going to ask the Corps of Engineers team if there's anything that you can think of. Again, if I misspoke on anything and you're thinking he was wrong about that, please correct me. And if not, if there's anything you want to add that you think is important, please do that. And then we'd like to allow members of the public here tonight any questions that you might have or anything you'd like to discuss, any feedback or comments you'd like to provide.
Chris, I was going to add something. Sorry. I wanted to, this gentleman's comment about flood insurance premiums. It comes up in pretty much every community that we're doing flood risk studies in. And I appreciate it because as a homeowner or a business owner, like, that's the thing that you probably most directly relate to, is how much money am I paying because my bank is requiring me to have flood insurance. Like, you probably don't relate to 100-year flood's gonna cause me this much damage to my property. It's a lot harder. That's a more amorphous thing to wrap your head around versus the amount of money that you're paying in insurance premiums. But like Chris and Patrick said, like, our economic policies don't allow us to capture that, but it certainly is a preeminent consideration with every community that we work with, in terms of one of the most motivating factors for why they want a project, is to try and help their community and, you know, get out from the burden of insurance requirements and insurance payments. So I definitely appreciate the comment.
Thanks, Greg. Ma'am, did you have a question?
I was just gonna ask, of the 12 different options that you've narrowed it down to, are they all pretty much aligned with the dike or levee where it currently is and just repairing it or enhancing it?
They are all pretty close, and I should just clarify, so we started with what we called 12 different alignments, and those were all, I'll go back to that slide for just a minute. I apologize, I'm gonna scroll through them because there we go. Sometimes I can just select it on here, but I'm not able to do that tonight. So in each of these areas, it's a different color here. We looked at different options. And so when we talked about those 12 alignments, we were counting that in, say, well, I'm actually going to, just a second, ma'am. I think I have a better graphic that can show this. Okay, so I'm just going to go to. So this is when we were looking at just reach one at possible levee alignments. And so we had one, what we called 1A1 and 1B1. So 1 means we were in reach 1, and then A was a sub reach, so a shorter section of that reach. And then the 1 refers to an alternative that we had in that sub reach. So in sub reach 1A, we only had one alternative, and same in sub reach 1B. But when we get to 1C, we had two different alternatives. We had 1C1 and 1C2. And so the difference between those is one of them would utilize sheet pile for that under seepage protection, and one would utilize a wide cross section with what's called a seepage berm. And the wide cross section of the seepage berm takes up more real estate than the one with the sheet pile, because that can be narrower. And so we looked at those two, and those two contributed to that 12 overall alignments that we had. And we have since narrowed that down to the one that's shown here, where we determined that of those two, say in that 1C subsegment, one of them was more economically feasible. And so now we've narrowed it down to the one basic alignment that, like you were asking, generally follows the existing levee alignment. And so what we would do in terms of reconstructing that is we would have to, in most cases, degrade the existing levee. So remove the soil from the existing levee and remove the trees and tree roots and so forth that are in it. And then we would aim to use as much of that material as we could to rebuild the levee, and we would recompact it. We may have to add additional material, say, if there's not enough clay, which is more of an impervious soil that we would use in levees. So we may add some soil to it, but we would try to reuse as much as we could and recompact it and regrade the side slopes, so that, for example, right now on the riverside, in a lot of places, it's very steep. It would have to be less steep. And then we would add that riprap protection and then reseed it, so there's grass protection. So the process would be basically degrading the existing levee and then rebuilding it, reusing as much of the material as we could.
Okay.
And Curtis, do you want to add to that?
Well, yeah, just to add to it, because to your point, this doesn't show all the sausage making. When we started, we had a lot of different alignments and we tried to get more aggressive with setbacks where we would.
I'm gonna go back to those.
No, this is fine. So we, I think in all the reaches, we had more than one alignment to look at because, setting it away from the river is obviously good for floodplain management. Give it more room. It doesn't have to be as high. It's
Curtis,
not attacked by the ice as much.
I apologize for interrupting, but if you want to point, will you come do it over
Sure.
here so it gets in the
Oh, yeah,
recording?
yeah.
Because I don't think otherwise it'll get recorded.
Yeah, so, can I get to the,
You want to go to
I can't
Patrick's?
go to the laser pointer, can I?
You can't, yeah.
Okay, that's right. So we looked at several different alignments through and behind the ball fields. And you get to a point where the impacts to real estate and just to the community and separating those things weren't good. We did look in this downstream reach, in reach 3. We looked at carrying, because this is an expensive stretch of river because of the cost of the erosion protection there, as you're all probably aware that where the Yellowstone comes in and attacks there, it's tough. But we also looked at an alignment along the slough. One problem there is then you're leaving a large number of homes on the wet side of the levee. So no one likes that, no one wants to do that, but it does give the river more room. So we did look at all those, but for one reason or another, they did not come out to be either economically feasible or publicly acceptable, I guess.
Right.
So,
Well, and I think most people in town, when we think about repairing what we call the dike, we're all thinking where it currently is. And I was just wondering if moving it or changing it or the slough project was even still in the picture or not. So, yeah.
they kind of all fell out. I mean, we had to give them a fair shake.
Right.
Had to give
Everything
it a
has to
fair
be
try
examined. Yes.
and
right.
documented, because otherwise that's the first thing we'll get asked when we start going through reviews. So yeah, we did
Okay.
look at that.
Awesome.
Sorry, I just wanted to.
No,
So-
perfect. Thank you,
So
Curtis.
does the different colors up there demonstrate different ways you're gonna rebuild it or whatever?
It doesn't really, ma'am. So the colors up there just show the sub reaches. When we were looking a moment ago, say at this picture. So in this one, the different colors did mean something different. So here, the orange line, correct me if I got this wrong, Patrick, but the orange line was using sheet pile and the yellow line would be not using sheet pile. And then down here, the purple line was doing a levee either with or without sheet pile. Excuse me, purple levee was with or without sheet pile, and then the pink one was using a flood wall. But ultimately, like Curtis was explaining, and Curtis, I appreciate you mentioning that because I failed to mention, like Curtis was saying, that we looked at even more than are shown on this map, like in the city park area, there were ones that would have gone back behind some of the ball fields. And the reason for even considering that was if you get that greater setback from the river, and maybe your requirement for arboring the levee would be less. But the trade-off is you impact a really valuable community resource. And as we went through that process of looking at those, we made determinations that some of those should drop out. And what's shown on that map that you were asking about, ma'am, is just whatever one we ultimately brought forward as the one that we thought was the most viable economically, and also other considerations went into that, like the community impacts and so on. So the colors don't really mean anything in this graphic, other than that's a subsegment that for which we chose some method of protection, some levee design. you have questions, sir?
So in the proposed, I'm just trying to think back to other meetings, but in this alignment here, this picture, like the tennis courts would stay still intact, the ball fields would stay intact.
So I think what we've identified, and Joshua or Curtis, either one of you help me out on this, I think what we've identified is that it's pretty close in those areas. Like, so for the ball fields, for example, there's a possibility that you'd have to change where the outfield fence is on the field that's closest to the river. But it wouldn't impact like I'm gonna call it the main ball field, the one that has the bleacher seats and everything. So we tried as much as we could to minimize those impacts. Is there anything you would add to that, Joshua?
No, just that, I'd say more or less, yes, this proposed alignment that we're showing follows the existing alignment. And for the most part, would have the same footprint. It may be a little bit wider in places due to seepage control that would be needed. But the embankment itself wouldn't shift by more than maybe 50 to 100 feet in most places, at the absolute most. And the only reason we would do that is usually erosion protection, where the levee is sitting right on the river bank and is at the highest risk.
Yeah, and I may not have done a very good job of explaining what I meant by seepage berm earlier, but what that refers to is that if you think of the levee cross section as being kind of like this with a flat top, that's this trapezoidal shape here. Then if you have under seepage happening onto the levee, there's different ways you can deal with that. The one way that minimizes the footprint is to have that sheet pile that goes down under the levee. And basically, when water tries to seep under the levee, it gets to that sheet pile and it has a much longer path it would have to go to seep around. So that helps cut off that seepage. The idea of a seepage berm is that on the land side of the levee, you have more soil piled up in a larger footprint. And again, that gives a longer path that seepage would have to travel before it could cause problems for the levee. And so that footprint that Joshua was talking about, if you have seepage berm as one of your under seepage control methods, that could widen that footprint and then potentially impact something like the ball fields that's not impacted by the current alignment.
So basically that smaller ball field, not the one with the stadium, we might lose parking along that area and that dike would come closer to a chain link fence or something like that, if I'm saying that right?
Yes, yeah, it could, or it could encroach some on the outfield, and so that would be one of the things we would have to consider in more detail, so right now, we talked about these lines that are up here. We have developed some more detailed preliminary drawings that help us envision what the footprint is, and we've used that in those cost estimates to estimate quantities and to try to get an estimate of what some of the costs of impacts on real estate are. But we would have to we'd have to refine those further to really understand. That would be part of that advancing the design from that 10% level to the 30% level, because usually by the time we're at that 30% level, we would want to feel like we're very confident about the footprint, because that helps us determine the impacts on real estate and on environmental resources and so on.
Part of that impact, if I'm hitting right on say the tennis court, that dike is really close to the tennis court.
Right.
Our town has a lot of sports, and if we had to, that's an economic impact of holding tournaments or whatever. I know a flood is a flood and the sports is sports, but is that put into that study too, the economics of sports? Because right now we're short on ball fields, and to lose one or during even the construction would be an economic to businesses or convenience stores, motels, on and on and on.
So I'm going to ask Patrick Nowak again to help me with that question. Is there a way we can capture those?
Yeah, so like impacts that, so sure, at this point in the study, no, that the impacts to the tennis courts and sports aren't something that, has gone into the analysis at this point, but earlier Chris talked about, there's other benefit categories such as regional economic benefits, and those are like the benefits to a specific community, not the national economic benefits, but regional economic benefits. And so that would be something that, we would look at something like the impacts to a community of losing a sporting event, like you mentioned. So that's something that we can consider, but so far we've been looking at the national economic development benefits at this point. So,
Chris, one other thing would be like, as we refine these designs and we get a better handle on facilities that are potentially impacted, like that conversation with the community will progress and like we certainly would replace those tennis courts if we were impacting them. We would figure out how to like reconfigure it so that you have the same number of courts or whatever, so that you don't have a lost, function if that's an important, facility for the community. That certainly is something that we would figure out how to factor into this, into the cost, so that you're not losing that function. Same with the ball field. If we have to do something with the fencing or something, we would, to the extent possible, we try to avoid it. But if we have to do something creative, we can come up with something creative.
Yeah. So you have any idea when you would think that you would have a final footprint?
So what we're thinking is that roughly if we say in February, we decide one way or the other that we want to continue the study under section 205 or the general investigation program. So between now and then, we'll be focused on trying to refine that information that we want to provide the city and to use ourselves to try to make that decision. But then if we decide that we're going forward under one of those study authorities, then our aim would be to try to have that design, that roughly 30% and a draft feasibility report hopefully by the end of FY, or excuse me, the end of the calendar year of 2022. So sometime maybe the fourth quarter of next year.
What is the land side of the levee? What does FEMA require for the runout before you put up a house, or a house has to be removed? How far out from the levee is that? How many feet? Is it a feet?
Joshua, I don't think for us, I think it's a Corps of Engineers requirement, right? Not a FEMA
Yeah,
requirement.
I don't know if FEMA has a specific requirement, but what the Corps has always said is 15 feet out past the toe of the embankment.
So once that levee has been pretty much finalized, the footprint, then people will know how much their property would be impacted, right?
Yes, sir.
So at that point, I've been thinking about this. What if you have people that see that, oh, they're going to be impacted, okay? At that point in time, their property would probably be just worth nothing. I mean, you'd never be able to sell it because you know it's going to be gone. I'm curious what the process is for those people at that time, when we know the levee's coming and it's a go and the footprint's there and you're sitting there thinking, ooh, so.
Sure. So the way that works is during a feasibility study, we're required to do what's called a gross appraisal. And so once we have that footprint developed, we have folks in our real estate office to go out and they would look at all the properties that would be impacted by it. Now, they don't actually go out and do field surveys or anything. They normally do searches of public records and assessors databases and so on to try to assess the value of that property. And that's used in determining the real estate cost for the project that goes into our overall cost estimate. Now, one of the requirements under either Section 205 or the General Investigations Program for implementation is that our local sponsor has to acquire any real estate that's required. So after we get past that gross appraisal and we say we get a project approved for implementation, then during design, when we work toward finalizing that design, usually about maybe the 95, between the 65 and the 95% stage of that design, we would have real estate folks that would work with the city to make sure that the city follows what's called the Uniform Relocation Act. So that means that even though the city as a non-federal sponsor would be acquiring that real estate, they need to follow the Federal Uniform Relocation Act, and that requires tract level appraisals be performed. So that's when a real estate professional goes out and actually gets right of entry to the property, to survey it, to appraise it, comes up with an appraisal, and then there's a whole process that I'm not going to try to describe because it's outside of my lane, but the government comes up, well, I should back up a little bit. The non-federal sponsor has to come up with that appraised value of the property. And then there's a process by which the government oversees that, the federal government, to make sure we're following the Uniform Relocation Act. And then the property owner has a chance to have their own appraisal done. And there's a process for finally negotiating what's a fair market value for the acquisition of that property. So like you said, if a person sees that their property would be impacted by that and then concludes that the property is then worthless, that might be true, if not for the fact that the non-federal sponsor has to acquire that property eventually under the Uniform Relocation Act, which requires them to pay fair market value. So that the same goes for, like, if we need to have an easement on property, if it doesn't have to be acquired in fee title, but there's an easement required, then there's a process for that to determine the cost that should be paid for the easement. So, Greg, is there anything you want to add to that?
I was going to say, the only thing I was going to add, Chris, because I think that was a pretty good summary. The Uniform Relocation Act is there to ensure that the property owners get fairly compensated. Like that's the whole reason it's there. So even if you know that there's a levy project that's going to impact your home, it doesn't mean it's not worth anything. It's still going to get appraised at fair market value, and sure, that's going to be, you can get your own appraisals as well. So I mean, it's not that it's going to be easy. Real estate is always challenging, but it's in there. It's there to protect the property owner. It's not there to protect the government. It's to protect the property owner.
Yeah, I was just concerned about the time from once it's finally settled, the footprint, what it might be 2 years out, 3 years out, I don't know. From that time that it's actually built, I just was curious when that kicks in. When, like you're sitting there, well, you're gonna have to be gone 2.5 years. Okay. Would the city be at that time obligated to settle up? I mean, get that process moving, or would the people have to sit there until it's actually bulldozed? That's what I'm just.
So we would have to work with the city on an implementation timeline, but before we can actually begin the construction, the city has to acquire all the necessary property for it.
Oh, before that.
So correct me if I'm wrong about that, Greg, but we can't start construction until all the property is acquired that's needed, because we don't want to start a project and then have it be stopped by, say, a legal challenge to an acquisition or something.
I see.
So we usually allow, depending on the sponsor, we allow like a year, 18 months, even 2 years for acquisition of all the real estate. And it just depends on how much real estate and what we think the complexity, if it's all property that belongs to one owner, then that's easier than if it belongs to 20 different owners.
Yeah.
So it would just all depend on what's potentially impacted.
With that footprint, have you come up yet with the amount of residences or people who would be impacted? Is there a number out there?
So the number that we have that we've been using, I'll go be fumble around for just a minute here. So in each of these, we have costs that sum up to that total we looked at. And so we have what we call required buyouts, which is our real estate cost. So that's a number of about $3.8 billion. And so that's based on very preliminarily, we've looked at, we can have parcel maps and we can look at where our alignment crosses those parcels. And then we came up with I want to stress how preliminary that number is. We just looked at, okay, that house, and didn't we just look at like an appraisal database or something, Patrick?
Right.
Yeah, so we just looked at, I think, the current appraised value of the property, and we assumed, again, correct me if I'm wrong, we assumed we would acquire the whole property in most cases.
Right.
Right, and so we would really have to sharpen the pencil, because there might be some places where it would, like to Joshua's point, you have to have a 15-foot setback of a home from the levee. Well, maybe that property has structures that are 15 feet setback already. Maybe there's an outbuilding that's not. So maybe we'd have to acquire some of the property in the outbuilding, but not the home, for example. And so we really have to sharpen the pencil on that before we start looking in detail. So this is just to try to give us an idea of kind of where we stand on overall potential real estate costs.
Thank you.
Sure.
So, the levy though that you are proposing, it's going to be a lot wider than what's there now. Probably.
In some places it would be, yes, because if it had that seepage berm, that would make it wider. There's a possibility that in some places it would be less wide as well if we're doing something like sheet pile. And generally, Joshua, I think it would be approximately the same footprint, except where we have a wider seepage berm. Is that correct?
Yeah. It would be very close.
Okay.
Where there are currently houses that are within that 15-foot zone is where things make it questionable.
That's 3.8 million that you mentioned. What year was, or what time zone was that done? 6 months ago, a year, or 2 days ago? Or
So
roughly.
Patrick, can you just talk about how
It's
we
been
update costs?
it's been within the past, 6 months.
Okay.
And what we do, sir, so we come up with that cost estimate, and then our economists index those costs up each year. And that indexing is an inexact science, but they try to make sure we're staying current with what current costs are.
I was just curious whether it was 5 years ago or 3 or so. Come back to Ken's question. I think, I don't know if you were asking that in that way, but is for that 3.8 million in buyouts, and how many properties does that, do we have a figure on how many locations? Is it 10, 15, 20, or 2, or?
Do you know off the top of your head how many it is, Patrick, approximately?
Yeah, it's under 20,
Okay,
but again,
that's
yeah,
good.
very preliminary.
And so one other question, talk about seepage and everything. Hasn't there been bore tests already done on our existing dike for repair, if I remember right, or an option or whatever? So do we have to do them? If they've been done, do we have to do that again?
Well, not necessarily. So we were talking about this earlier in the day. I asked Joshua that question, and we wouldn't necessarily have to do more, but we would that I use that as an example of something that we might do as we advance the design. And so I'm not really sure, Joshua, you know better than I do what's been done in the past.
We have a lot of historical data from tests that have been done in the past. There's just a few areas where we might need to do some sampling and testing where we don't have much data currently.
So we have worked with Sam and with the city's consultant KLJ over time to try to make sure that all the existing data that's available, that we're using that and we're not redoing work that needs to be, that's already been done. So
Thank you.
anyone have any other questions or comments?
What do we need to know that has been left out of this? Honestly.
I'm trying to think. We tried to cover, at least, like I said, at the level of detail that we have now, everything that we know now. I think the biggest kind of uncertainty with the project right now is what's the best way to proceed. So if we decide, we talked at some length earlier with the city about, well, if we did go to that general investigations route, what's the likelihood of actually implementing a project? And I think what we identified is that with that, there's more risk, I'll say, because like I said, with the Section 205 approach, we have a lower level of authority, so that it's our division level instead of our headquarters. And so there's a little more risk when you go up to the headquarters of getting a project approved, you're getting your recommendation approved. And then when it comes to implementation in the Section 205 program, there's money that's allocated to that each year. And so you don't have to seek specific authorization, you just have to ask for money. And if it's available, you can go right into design and construction. Whereas with the general investigation program, you have to seek congressional authorization. And so your project is competing with other projects from around the nation. And there's obviously a political side of that equation, who gets what into the Water Resources Development Act. So maybe something that I didn't emphasize enough is there's different relative risks of actually getting a project ultimately implemented, whether it's general investigations or Section 205. And I think that ideally, and Sam, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think ideally the city and I know the Corps would prefer if we could keep it in Section 205 if there was some change to that maximum project cost. But barring some change like that, we don't really think that that's probably a viable option. So that would be one thing. As far as anything else that we don't know, I mean, one of the things that we as the Corps don't know too is, and we've tried to account for, we're like I said, very preliminary level of design. So we try to account for any surprises down the road that we might encounter during design. So that's where, like right now, we have a 25% contingency in our costs. And we would hope that as we refine our design, we'll get a better handle on the things that could impact the cost, and we'll be able to reduce that contingency. So oftentimes, as the project is developed further, the costs will go up. Sometimes they'll go down, but either way, you can usually reduce that contingency because you begin to have a better understanding about what some of the uncertainties were when you started. So that's kind of an unknown that's still out there. But I'd say we try really hard to try to make sure there's not some gotcha later on with the cost where we say, oh, shoot, we forgot something big and the cost is double now. That's why we've kind of done those bookends with that low and high estimate. I can't really think of anything else as far as like stuff that you should know. I mean, I know there's been a couple questions about the real estate. Like we were saying, we have a map that shows properties that would be impacted by the alignment we have right now, but that's so preliminary that we've just kind of put that super general number on it. And we usually don't try to have specific discussions because, we're talking about people's property and we don't want people to think, well, my property is gonna be impacted if it ends up that it's not. Or someone to think, well, it's not gonna be impacted and ultimately ends up that it did. So we don't really talk about that in more detail until like the 30% level of design when it's, a little more. I'm not gonna say nailed down because that doesn't happen until even like 65 to 90% design, but at least at 30%, we have a little better idea.
I was gonna say the same thing, Chris, that this is a feasibility study, so the goal of this is to show that, hey, we think we can build a project here that has greater benefits than it does costs. And so in a previous section 205 in Schuyler, Nebraska, we were changing the alignment up to, during design, past the feasibility phase, we got into full design and we were changing it for one reason or another, way into 95% design. And then like you mentioned earlier, we can't even advertise a contract until all the real estate has been certified as, and the federal government never purchases any, or, purchases any land. That's all the non-federal sponsor.
I mean, related to that, when it does go into the design phase, once the project's approved, like in Schuyler's case, almost all of those design revisions were what's our design team sitting down with those affected landowners and figuring out how to tweak the project so that it was the most amenable to them. It's going to impact them regardless, but I got to relocate this guy's center pivot. Like, okay, well, what's the best place to put this center pivot so that you can get the best coverage on the remaining property that you're trying to irrigate? Where do you want the ramps so that you have access over the levee, that kind of stuff. I mean, we did a lot of that, and we would do that on every project. We would work with the affected landowners, the city on the parks areas, and just figure out like what kind of tweaks can we make to the design that would, be the least impactful. We don't really have the level of detail in the feasibility study to hash out all of that kind of stuff. So we try to just make sure that we have the costs accounted for and we have enough representation of what those real estate footprints look like so that people have awareness of what it looks like it's going to be. And then a lot of the details will get hashed out in the design phase. One thing I was going to say about related to the one question, in terms of the timing, if there is a property, it's a little bit risky. It's risky on the part of the sponsors. So the city, maybe in partnership with the county, if the project is moving forward and a property that's needed comes up for sale, is the city going to go buy it and then have it and then run the risk that the project gets delayed? Or are they going to just leave it? I'm dealing with this on a project in Missouri Valley right now where a property went up for sale. It's in the floodplain. It's in the footprint of where the levee needs to be. It never sold and it's been boarded up. It got condemned and it's just been sitting there as like this eyesore in the community, and the city's trying to wrestle with whether they're going to buy it or what they're going to do with it. But we don't have an approved project yet, so it's kind of a chicken and egg kind of decision for them to make. And every community kind of has to wrestle with that. If you acquire it before the project's approved and we start the implementation process, there's that risk. But ultimately, from a cost share standpoint, you'd still get credit for it, whether you already own it or if you have to go acquire it. If it's property that's needed for the footprint, you still get credit for it. So the part that goes through the park, even though the city already owns probably all of that land, the part that the footprint of the levee would be on, the city would get credit for that as part of their cost share for the construction phase. So I mean, those specific instances come up as far as the timing of whether it makes sense to buy something when it's available versus let it sell. And then potentially have to acquire it from whoever the new owner is a few years later. And you just have to kind of weigh what makes the most sense for your community if that situation arises.
Sir, if we call Billings, Montana and going eastern Montana, is there other projects, other towns that you're working on now with this, or are there proposed communities that are gonna be facing what we are, like Forsyth, Isham, Glendive?
Glendive, I think Greg would be better able to answer that question than I am.
We just signed a cost share agreement with Glendive to start a 205 feasibility study, I mean, literally last month. So that study is, once the funding filters its way down from Washington, then we'll start that study. And that funding should be here either this week or next week. I do know that Glasgow has issues. I don't know if Forsyth has issues or not. Glasgow is the only other one that I know of in the eastern part that definitely has similar floodplain issues with an existing levee, but not as extensive as Miles City, or probably not even as extensive as Glendive. That's the only one that I know of right now in eastern Montana. We're not doing a study there right now. I just know
Right,
that they've been kicking around whether they want to do one or not.
they're in the same situation we are, they need to. So
They need
for-
to, they need to do something
Yeah,
probably.
for the economics of their town, the same way as we are.
So when this is complete, will it change the footprint of our floodway? And take less of the percentage of Miles City being in the 100-year floodplain?
Nolan, can you help answer that?
Probably shouldn't change the floodway if we don't do anything to the channel, but the hope would be then that it could be accredited and would be safe from the floodplain for 100-year mappings there.
Okay, so less of our town would be in that, but the floodway would.
They'd have to
reduce.
update the maps for that instead of go through a map change process, but you could then accredit that levy and have protection behind it.
Okay.
Thanks, Nolan.
The floodway here is a little bit weird because the levee's not recognized, so it's pretty wide. But assuming that we design a levee that is above the 100-year and is creditable, then the floodway would end up being on the riverside of the levee.
Oh, perfect. That would be
So-
wonderful.
So it would remove the property behind the levee from both the floodplain and the floodway.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Yes.
Any other questions or comments there? It has, I'm gonna put that public involvement slide up again if I so that everyone can have another look at that. And Sam, I think you said this is going to be posted on the city's website, so this. should be
Yeah, we're
there.
gonna try and figure out how to get this on, it'll be on YouTube, but we'll have a link to that on our city website and on the Facebook page. We've never done this before.
Okay.
But this is something we want to do because I actually have a lot of other presentations that I'm not able to put on our webpage because they're too big. There's just too much information for me to put them on there. Because some of them involve the risk rating 2.0, which is a very big thing, as I know you would know. And yeah, I'm confused on it too. But and so that way it can get out to the public and it will be up there. Well, YouTube, so probably forever.
My 9-year-old son will be pleased if I show up on YouTube.
You'll be a
So make it
sensation.
go viral.
I did think of something, Chris, to this gentleman's question about like, what did we leave out?
Okay.
We didn't talk about Reach 4.
That's a good point.
In Reach 4, west bank of the Tongue River, right now, we're proposing to only do some non-structural in the fairgrounds area, and that which would be floodproofing some of those properties that are at risk now. A lot of them aren't at much risk for flooding below the 100-year flood elevation. So there might only be a few structures that are in that area that we would actually propose to flood proof, but the details of that haven't been hashed out entirely yet. But we won't build a levee on the other side of the Tongue River. It'll only be on the side where the current levee is.
That's a good point. That's great. Any other questions anyone has, or anyone from the core team, anything you think is important to add or subtract if I said something wrong, subtract it for me. Okay. Well, I really appreciate everyone's interest in the project and coming out, and Sam has been very good about having us give community updates, whether it be at Flood Awareness Day or at meetings like this. So, you know, our next, I'm going to say required public meeting under our Corps of Engineers study process would be when we have a draft report that's ready for public review. We would come out and do a public meeting to talk about the report then. But like I said, Sam's been really good about getting us out to update the community at other times. And so we'll continue to work with her on doing that. I look forward to being back out next time we have more information to share. And engagement, you know, at any time is welcome by the contact here on the slide. Those come to John Sheldon, who's our environmental resource specialist, and myself typically. So we get those and we share them with the team. Okay. Well, thank you. And Sam, did you have anything else you wanted to say?
I don't, I think everyone signed in. Feel free to, I guess, grab something on your way out. And thank you for coming, and please, if you know of anyone that wanted to see this and they weren't able to, I will let you guys know. I sent out just a general email to everybody on my email when we will have this up. It might take me a while because we've never done this before, but we will get it up, and I will let everybody know, and I might even try and put something in the paper so that people know that this is available.
Thank you guys for your time. Thanks for coming to Miles City.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
And thanks, Sam, for setting us up.